Good afternoon, you guys, and welcome back to the Hidebound Convivium. It is currently May the 12th, 2021, and today it's been a long time since I've done any sort of political or cultural commentary video. So I wanted to jump in with a few comments regarding sort of a line of inquiry I've had about the political situation in the United States for quite a long time now. It's sort of a line of thought I've been developing for a few months. Uh, and as I was thinking about it a little bit more, I thought this would be an interesting topic to just sort of do a long form video on. So today I'm going to be talking on the topic of the Philologists Century. At least that's what I'm calling it. Essentially, my thesis is that going forward into the future, especially with the proliferation of mass communications technology, that language, more so than at any other point in history, perhaps, is going to be, and specifically wars between languages, are really what's going to define cultural and ethnic struggles going forward into the 21st century, which of course I'm dubbing the Philologist Century. So the first question I might want to answer is, why do I call the 21st century the Philologist Century? Um, well, on the one hand, I think we should juxtapose sort of my idea of the 21st century with what has heretofore been the vision of the 21st century. And the 21st century, for lack of a better term, has been, was imagined to be sort of the century of the eschaton, right? This was the century of the eschaton of a liberal democracy, let's say. So the 21st century was supposed to be that time in which we perfected the craft of liberal democracy and capitalism. Um, sort of where neoliberalism reaches its zenith, where history is officially over, and then we can start to discuss different, uh, extensions of the neoliberal capitalist framework out into. You could just talk about its extension out into space. So it's kind of like, again, to use this sort of Christian theological lens to it. The 21st century was the New Jerusalem coming down, and now we're remaking all of creation around the triumph of neoliberal capitalism. And of course, what the 21st century has shaped up to be so far, and here we are almost a quarter of a way into it, it has really just served to undermine it it pumped the brakes on the end of history pretty quickly. What we're seeing right now with just a couple of key examples, right? Coronavirus is one. Just the absolute frailty of the national economic systems, really around the world, when faced with a kind of what was really in essence a kind of crisis that all human civilizations have kind of had to cope with. And whatever the reason may be, coronavirus itself was a fairly mild global pathogen as far as global pathogens go. And the it wasn't so much that we had a total breakdown in order. It's just that it sort of smashed a lot of economic paradigms that we had put in place, scrambled sort of people's confidence. That was a big one. Scrambled people's confidence in the economic system, and disrupted the sort of steady churn of capital. The most important thing about coronavirus, I think, was not so much the damage that it did, which I think it did a fair amount of economic damage to the middle class, especially insofar as there is one left. But the main damage that it did was just sort of prove that even with a relatively minor, in world historical scales, kind of global crisis, all of the gears of global finance and capital just kind of grind to a halt. And that is not confidence inducing in the system. Then you have other, just this week, right? You had a ransomware attack on a gas pipeline, which cut off access to gasoline in like the Carolinas and East Tennessee and Virginia and West Virginia, and like a whole swath of the country, right? And now there are people out panic buying gasoline, just like in the gasoline shortages in the 70s. And it reminds people, just these sort of crises like this, it sort of reminds people that, oh, yeah, actually, uh, we're not, progress isn't, it's not a, it's not a given, right? So we have this understanding that as we approach the end of history, all of our problems get easier and easier, that society gets more ordered, everything becomes more predictable, because, more or less what you're talking about when you're talking about the eschaton of neoliberal capitalism is you're talking about a world that is predictably profitable for sort of the meritocratic stakeholders, the noble class who are responsible, right, for our situation in this current environment. So that's the paradigm that you expect to see going into the century that is supposed to be the last century. It's supposed to be the end of all historical events, essentially. And what you find is that actually this incredibly top heavy, incredibly inefficient in some sense, um, um, incredibly strained and sort of overwrought world financial system is just it's just incredibly fragile. And that's the opposite of the expectation that we had, right? The expectation was that as we progress towards this utopic vision, everything's going to get better, everything's going to get easier, everything's going to get more robust. What we're seeing is the opposite. We're seeing that everything is kind of sitting on a thread. For example, today, I mean, the electricity went off in my apartment in the whole town and all the surrounding towns for several hours with no warning. And nobody knows why. It could be a maintenance thing. It could be that the power plant's out of fuel. Whatever the case may be, right? There is this overarching sense that we are becoming enmeshed in sort of the the downward spiral of an entropic process. That I to go back to a science fiction example, right? The Galactic Empire in the Foundation novels just sort of spun itself. You can think of it almost like we're in a centrifuge and we're just spinning so fast that eventually we fly off the centrifuge. And that's kind of the feeling that a lot of people have about the 21st century. So that was so there's expectation, there's reality. So, what does this mean going forward? Why is the 21st century instead the philologist century? Well, the more I've thought about distinct people groups and what comes after essentially the effective dissolution of the United States, which could be in a generation or probably not 10 generations, probably sooner than that, but it could be in 20 years, could be in 100 years. But there is there is certainly a sense that the United States. before I move on, another another sort of damning piece of evidence against that, ushers in the end of history, is the emphasis on retrenchment and moving away from entanglements in the Middle East, which has been the project of the United States now for 20 years. And very often you see this with empires right before they absolutely implode. Obviously, the example that most people think about, because it's so fresh and compares so well, is the Soviet Union imploding after the invasion of Afghanistan. Um, but yeah, the United States has been involved in all these different countries in the Middle East for 20 years, has nothing to show for it, is actually, in some sense, well, in many senses, worse off for their involvement in all these different proxy wars. And in all of these instances, failed to accomplish really their primary objectives, whatever they were. So, there's another example of how sort of neoliberal, meritocratic, technocratic, sort of the expertise system that was supposed to deliver us better and better, supposed to deliver us more stable, more stability, more freedom, more democracy, gave us literally none of those things. Um, but anyway, going back to the question of the philologist century, right? So, whatever the case may be for the United States, however long it remains, it seems obvious that there is a coming separation between peoples in the United States. And mainly right now, it manifests in a rural urban divide. And people want to talk about sort of urban centers not being, one caveat that people want to give, right, is that not all urban centers are homogenous. And that is true. There are some urban centers that are all urban centers are culturally distinct in their own sort of way, um, but they have much more in common with each other than they do with any of the sort of rural land in between. Sort of like, I believe in, perhaps it's an illusion in Confederacy of Dunces. But I remember there is someone. I remember reading someone talk about how most metropolitan cities, especially this is especially the case in modern times, because well, that's in a second, right? Is that port cities are very similar to each other because they are all cosmopolitan, just by virtue of there being a port city, and so they're different than, say, a city that's more inland, like a river city, or a manufacturing city like Pittsburgh. Of course, in the modern era, right, because the paradigm of interstate and um, uh, in, travel between land masses and between sort of settled areas, because that's mostly done by automobile and airplane, and because most cities, well, all cities have automobile connections, and then most cities also have some kind of, at least a small airport. Um, they all just sort of take on the paradigm of the port city. So it used to be you would have your port cities that were more cosmopolitan. You have your interior cities that had their own sort of interior city culture. And now you're just looking at port city, cosmopolitan sort of paradigm, cultural paradigm, with increasingly insular rural areas, because rural areas are becoming increasingly economically superfluous. And a lot of that has to do with the institutionalization, industrialization, and financialization of agriculture. So now, rural people, by and large, are not actually responsible themselves for producing the food that feeds people in the metropolitan areas. So, sort of, they themselves, as a demographic, are actually superfluous to the financial and productive ends of whatever nation state they're a part of. which is a huge paradigm shift, really. And really, the story of the 21st century, especially, has been increasing concentration. So what first happened was, as I described, right, the agricultural sector became more and more industrialized and controlled by fewer and fewer um, um, uh, corporate interests. And then your smaller scale heartland manufacturing cities, through the process of globalization and outsourcing, um, because these people in these inland cities, Detroit especially, right? Those people also became economically superfluous. So the process has been continually generating um, more and more economic output and more economic value in the handful of very, very large urban centers, the small handful of megalopolises in the United States and the coastal areas, and everyone else becomes more and more economically superfluous. And this is why, in a large part, right, when we have our culture wars, and a large part of it is about ideology, about values, because the battle between the people in these highly productive urban centers and in the sort of left behind rural and heartland cities, it really is ideological, in the sense that there was an ideological component to why the United States transferred its wealth and productive capacity into these handful of cities. Like, think of it like playing a game of Civilization. Maybe this is a little bit too nerdy of a reference, but I think people will understand. There's a difference playing Civilization. The latest one I played is Civ 4, but there's a difference between playing tall and wide. You play wide, you attempt to have a very large empire with lots of food, so that you have lots of citizens to work all the different tiles, and you make use of most of the land mass of your particular nation state. So that we could think of that as sort of the typical pre-modern paradigm, or just sort of the traditional paradigm in the United States, where we had lots and lots of smaller cities spread out and a lot more people living in rural areas. And then you contrast that with playing tall, which is essentially to get the largest cities possible, and then in those cities have highly productive specialists who can more efficiently, um, you know, uh, research technologies, build things, whatever. Um, and so that's sort of the strategy that most Western nations have prioritized, is quote unquote playing tall, having these handful of highly productive urban areas. The thing about that is, though, there was nothing about this that necessarily made this a foregone conclusion. I'm not. Um, I don't think that economic development of nation states in the 20th and 21st century was some kind of like Darwinian process where there was just uh, there was a pathway that was more efficient, and the market, the free hand of the market or whatever, in this sort of evolutionary process, slowly moved the Western countries into this paradigm. I don't think this is like a foregone conclusion, or like there were impersonal forces involved. There were very deliberate, um, choices made along the way that prioritized the interests and the wealth of these high output urban areas over the rest of the country. And those personal decisions that politicians and political groups made became codified in certain ideological structures. One of which being neoliberal capitalism, just to use a very vague catch-all term, but essentially the sort of meritocratic, credentialite, elitist attitude of sort of the Beltway crowd naturally is a natural outgrowth of the desire of people in a republic who are part of a faction to loot the state to benefit their group of people at the expense of other people. So ultimately, there is an aspect of the sort of culture war in the United States that is ideological, because the embrace of our sort of paradigm of capitalism and neoliberalism and meritocracy, elitism. I'm just going to throw isms at you, but you sort of understand the complex that I'm describing. The adoption of this ideology was instrumental to it wasn't superfluous in any regard, or it wasn't um, arbitrary. That's what I'm trying to say. The ideological confrontation is not arbitrary, but the ideological confrontation also, you shouldn't let it obscure the fact that we're also talking about battles for material. We're talking about two groups that are each attempting to loot the state for their own benefit, because that is generally speaking what factions in a republic do. And it just so happens that one faction has been looting the state longer. They have built up systemic and institutional advantages, and they will continue to loot the state, and they will continue to punish their enemies because they are their enemies ad infinitum until something in the paradigm changes. And that's what I think inevitably will end up coming down the pipe, is some kind of paradigm change. Now, what the actual vehicle of that is unknown, and those who imagine it to come about will probably pin it to some sort of concrete event that will parallel some other historical event. So, we want to pin we want to draw a parallel between the fall of the Roman Empire and the fall of the United States as we experience it, because there are very many parallels. The United States is this all powerful global hegemon, and just like Rome, right, the United States is increasingly reliant on the importation of foreign labor, for example. This was a big thing in ancient Rome, as they imported lots of, I remember, Syrian slaves, I think, primarily, but they were importing slaves to do public works. They had, a large section of the Roman army was actually Germanic auxiliaries by the end of the empire. And not only that, but you're talking about by the end of the imperial period, you're talking about them having these gigantic cities, metropolises by pre-modern standards, and as the empire slowly dissolves, nobody can maintain these metropolises, and they start to fall into ruin. And you can see a kind of parallel in the United States. Like a big thing with sort of major metropolitan cities in the United States is that the economics behind city financing and maintenance is very dodgy. This is why you have, I live in Tennessee, for example, and it is very common in Southwest Tennessee to hear about some new community that was annexed by Memphis. Memphis is the largest city in Tennessee, I believe, still. And in order to keep itself solvent, because its interior neighborhoods don't generate any money, because it's not it's not a very economically vibrant city, they have to keep annexing the wealthy suburbs of the city in order to maintain the solvency of the city. They have to do the same thing in Louisville, which is I have some relatives that live up in Louisville. They did the same thing. And you have cities that have to annex their entire county um, just to remain solvent, because um, you'll consistently find that the tax revenue that these cities actually need to maintain all their services just keeps moving farther and farther away. A, not to be taxed, but B, because there is this sort of death spiral of, we have these large urban population, or these large urban centers that are not being adequately policed. They don't have adequate medical services. They don't have adequate access to food, for example. And they have large homeless populations, or they have large populations of people who can't find work and who are on the dole. And, all of this contributes to, you have lots of people who need city services and none of them can pay for it. And so you're going out, you're grabbing other communities to squeeze them for tax revenue to be able to run the city. But then in the process, a bunch of people move away. They just move farther so that you can't tax them. But B, you also then have to provide services for those people. You have to provide police and fire and waste disposal. I remember this was a big thing in Cordova when it got annexed by Memphis, and everyone was in an uproar because the Memphis they switched their garbage service, and the Memphis garbage service was far inferior. And so you just see examples like this of these municipal areas that are struggling to maintain solvency. Obviously, you have extreme examples like Detroit, which is just bankrupt. And you know, it's not only is it the case that these smaller inland cities are becoming increasingly sort of squeezed out, and the sort of logistics of city building, especially the way that we build our cities that are heavily automobile dependent. So the logistics just isn't panning out. It's too expensive to maintain the cities for the level of economic activity that we have within them. But then, even in these cities that are very, very economically productive, there's only a few areas of the city that are extremely economically productive, and is everything else will slowly dilapidate. Right there, you get fringes of slums on around all of these cities, right? And eventually, because the problem of slums and the problem of badly maintained roads and city services is not just a benign problem like, oh well, it's there's just a bad part of town, whatever. These social problems that come along with having poorly maintained cities um, will ultimately empty a city out, because people will leave for one reason or another, because people don't want to be the victims of crime. People, eventually, economic activity will leave if there's more crime, and we could talk about the cultural aspects of increased crime, but we won't get into that. But suffice to say that recent reforms in our thinking about policing, especially in um, these metropolitan areas, have not been helpful for this. But in essence, it's becoming increasingly clear that the sort of logistics for managing these gigantic cities are becoming too complicated, and the money to maintain them is becoming scarcer. I mean, insofar as money can be scarce in a fiat currency economy, with heavy level, with lots of borrowing and so to speak. Um, but at any rate, um, so we conceive of this event, this end of the United States as we understand it, so to speak, the fall of the American Empire, and it may or may, perhaps history does repeat itself, and all polities are bound to find themselves at an end at some point. But more or less, the important thing is not so much that the nation state that is the United States crumbles. It's more that the overarching national structures that serve to codify the national economy and sort of channel all of the nation's productive energies in one direction. So that system that heretofore I have been calling neoliberal capitalism, just for lack of a better term, but is the system, the machine, as I might poetically describe it if I was trying to be sort of poetic or metaphorical about this. But the overall, right now we have a centrally directed mechanism that directs all of the economic resources in the United States more or less in one direction. And whenever that paradigm ceases to exist, there you will have your turnaround, fall of the empire moment, even if it's not the quote unquote fall of the empire. And at that point, you're going to have, at the very least, two different distinct ethnoses, two different distinct tribes. Because the ideological, cultural, and economic circumstances of these two groups of people, at the least two groups, but probably more, have diverged so drastically. And the main unifying tie that binds, so to speak, that's going to allow us to draw lines around which different, who's in what tribe, and where we go from there. That sort of main distinguishing marker is going to be language. Now, the sort of, for lack of a better term, the progressive faction, right? The faction of those interested in eminentizing the eschaton of neoliberal capitalism, right? They are very much interested in stamping out these linguistic differences, which is, which is why, in some sense, we have this battle over so-called political correctness, right? Why we've been doing this now for 20, maybe 30 years, is that people at base understand that even if they can't appeal to the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which, whatever, people intuitively understand, at least in the weak sense, right, that language is highly determinant of cultural beliefs, of cultural affiliation, and of decision making and general attitude about the world. I've written essays about this in other places, but the long and short of it is that in the United States, we see the development of at least two separate linguistic groups, and we can identify them by dichotomies in how they conceptualize the same word in the English language, because they ostensibly both speak English, right? But you think about sort of the wars over definition. What that is it's an attempt to lay claim on a language and then imperialize, sort of use this linguistic token as a symbol of imperial authority and stamp it on other people to assimilate them. And you can't assimilate what is fundamentally not distinct from you. So to give a good example, right, we have the concept man and woman, and to most people, before a certain time period. Man and woman, these don't have any kind of any kind of cultural baggage, really. It's just there are the human race is a sexually dimorphic species. There are boys and girls that grow up to be men and women. Men and women get married, they have kids, and this has been our general understanding of the terms since the dawn of time, basically, or since the beginning of the English language, in the case of man and woman, right? Or the codification of modern English, I guess. Um, and now we have this. So we have extra connotations being added on. We have extra cultural associations being added on. And make no mistake, just because the definition itself doesn't necessarily change, although it has changed, um, just because the definition itself hasn't necessarily changed, the dictionary is still the same or whatever, doesn't mean that these two terms aren't diverging linguistically. So one group of people has sort of the legacy understanding of the terms man and woman. Another group of people has a radically different concept of what a man is or what a woman is, right? Because then you can have the concept of a man who does not have male genitalia. And at no point in the past would this have, and at no point in the past, and more importantly, with the other linguistic tribe in the United States, this idea has no truck. It doesn't make sense. This is a paradox. You can't have a man without male genitalia. It's like having it's like having a married bachelor. Well, in for another tribe, this is not a paradox at all. Actually, this is almost a tautology, that you can have a man who doesn't have male genitalia, because they don't believe, or the cultural conception of what a man is radically divorced. So the term's the same. The sound that you make with your mouth is the same. The letters on the paper are the same. They're arranged in the same order, but you're talking about two different distinct concepts. And we're in a very early stage of linguistic drift. And how these two ethnoses, people groups, even though they are relatively have the same sort of genetic admixture, right? They're not at this stage, we wouldn't really consider them separate ethnicities, but they're going to diverge as peoples because of their linguistic distinction. So really, the different people groups that emerge in the 21st century, that will start to emerge in the 21st century, will probably continue to emerge into the 22nd century. Because whenever you have these collapse of empire sort of scenarios, you have the ascendancy of sometimes entirely new people groups. Like before the fall of the Roman Empire, who were the Saxons? Who were the Angles? Who were the Jutes? They probably were there, at least in some sort of seed form, but they don't really burst onto the scene of world history until they get from under the shadow of the Roman Empire. Same sort of thing with our distinct American ethnoses. And the North American continent is so large that sort of in a natural political setting, you would have various separate ethnoses, people groups. And it's just that we live in a very atypical or unnatural political time because of the fact that we failed to acclimate to mass media and to rapid communications technology. But when you see a receding of imperial power in North America, what you also see is a return of natural political institutions. At least that's what I imagine, right? Is that once people get acclimated to and sort of inured to, or the effects of mass media communications are sort of dulled in some sense, you'll have a reemergence of a more natural political state of affairs, and that will involve multiple people groups in the North American area, because it's such a large geographic area with very diverse terrain, etc., etc. So when you're cataloging and categorizing the rise of these new and distinct nations, is what they essentially would be, proto nations. Um, the defining characteristic is going to be language. Now, within the language, there will be certain ideological presuppositions buried, probably, because history doesn't exactly repeat itself. It's kind of like a spiral staircase, right? Some made this um, made this analogy. So the 19th and 20th centuries were centuries of ideology, more so than any other century. And considerations of ideals and beliefs about the world became central to the conceptions that certain people groups had of themselves. And that will probably continue to be a future of ethnic formation going forward. A feature of ethnic formation going forward into the future. And ultimately, what I think this reflects in the North American context, or in the world context, right, is this sort of dual function of language in the history of man, right? So whatever you want to think about the Tower of Babel story, or Babel, however you want to pronounce it, the confusion of tongues is a punishment. It's something that God punishes mankind with, because without some sort of way to divide them into what we now might think of as natural kin group, which is essentially what a nation is sort of an extension of natural kin group. So in order God had to divide people into nations in order to avoid this kind of Promethean impulse. And we saw in the 20th and 21st century, with the emergence of sort of this global complex, these people very, very much interested in creating a global civilization, a global human identity, that it took on this kind of Promethean aspect. And so, there's no sort of it's no surprise that it sort of ends up the same way, that the what is the undoing of one of the first thing would be the undoing of the other thing. But another instructive sort of example that we have of how language divides and binds people is sort of in the communion of nations during the Middle Ages, right? You have Latin Christians and Greek Christians, and the liturgical tongue, for example, is a way to take the people of multiple nations and give them a ready tie in the liturgical act that binds them together, while at the same time allowing them to maintain their distinct ethnic, national identity. And ultimately, the Middle Ages, I think, are they're sort of the height of what we might call natural, or sort of perfected political paradigms in terms of what humankind can accomplish without the aid of technology, so to speak. Because the Middle Ages, you're talking about a time that's pre technological, especially in regards to communications. Once you have things like the printing press, which leads on to mass communications, what you start having is really breakdowns or extensions of unnatural political paradigms, because political paradigms are built on language. People have always said that nations are languages with standing armies, and to a large extent, that's true. The language is the primary unit by which a nation is organized, and sort of the outlook, worldview, or approach that a language allows to a people is what's going to, most importantly, it's what's going to allow them to delineate from us, not us. My tribe, not my tribe. It's not so much like as the strong version of the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis sort of argues that their opinions and beliefs about the world are determined in some sense by their language. It's more that the language influences a general outlook, but also b it just allows for a proliferation of a diversity of really a diversity of human experiences of the world. That's kind of what languages allow for, and it's that diversity, which is really a true sort of humane diversity, a natural diversity that human beings sort of crave, have these linguistic kin groups. It's a reemergence of that kind of diversity that will ultimately sort of bring about the end of history, will create a new paradigm, and will usher in what I have so eloquently described in this very rambling discussion as the Philologist Century. At any rate, guys, that's my talk for today. And if you are at all confused, which I'm sure you probably would be, um, you feel free to leave a comment down below and spur on the discussion. Because by all means, I don't consider myself a very intelligent person, so I would just love to hear what you guys think and your feedback. But other than that, I don't have anything else to add. I hope you guys have a lovely rest of the day. God bless, and goodbye.